In the high, desolate mountains of Colorado, in the year 1879, the ambitious mining town of Prosperity's Reach suffered a series of catastrophic failures that brought it to ruin in less than 7 months. Perfectly maintained steam engines exploded without cause, the town's state-of-the-art telegraph system melted into slag, and geological survey equipment spun uselessly in the hands of trained engineers. The official report, compiled by investigators from Denver, blamed a combination of extreme weather and geological anomalies unique to the region. But the private journal of the town's physician, Dr. Alistair Finch, tells a different story. It describes the arrival of a 12-year-old orphan named Thaddeus Crane, a boy whose quiet presence coincided with every single disaster. Dr. Finch's meticulous notes document a phenomenon for which 19th-century science had no name, a living catalyst of chaos, whose very existence seemed to unravel the fundamental laws of physics. What the town of Prosperity's Reach believed to be a curse was something far more terrifying, a force of nature wearing the face of an innocent child. Before we uncover the story of Thaddeus Crane and the town that was dismantled by his silent presence, make sure you are subscribed to this channel and have enabled all notifications. We explore the darkest and most inexplicable corners of American history, and you won't want to miss what's coming next. And let us know in the comments what state you're from. These forgotten histories have a way of being closer to home than you think. Now, let us journey back to a place where progress and ambition collided with a mystery that science still dares not acknowledge. Prosperity's Reach was born from the singular vision of one man, Colonel Jefferson Meade, a Civil War veteran who had traded his saber for a surveyor's transit and his military ambitions for the promise of mineral wealth. In 1876, Meade had discovered a rich vein of silver ore deep within the San Juan Mountains, a location so remote and inhospitable that most prospectors had dismissed it as unreachable. But where others saw impassable cliffs and deadly winters, Colonel Meade saw opportunity. He secured funding from a consortium of East Coast investors, promising them a town built on the principles of modern engineering, a technological oasis in the heart of the unforgiving wilderness. By 1879, Prosperity's Reach was a testament to his ambition. Nestled in a high mountain valley at over 10,000 feet, the town was a marvel of Victorian engineering. A state-of-the-art stamp mill, its massive iron hammers pounding ore into dust 24 hours a day, stood as the town's mechanical heart. A complex system of aqueducts and flumes, designed by engineers from the finest schools in Boston, channeled mountain streams to power the machinery and provide the town with fresh water. The telegraph office, housed in a proud brick building on the main street, connected Prosperity's Reach to the outside world, a vital link that felt like a triumph of human will over the isolating power of the mountains. The town's population had swelled to nearly 500 souls, a mixture of hardened Cornish miners, ambitious young engineers, and the families who had followed them into the high country, drawn by the promise of high wages and a future built on silver. The social and moral life of the community was overseen by two men who represented the competing philosophies of the age. Reverend Michael Gable, a stern Methodist preacher, saw the town's success as a sign of God's favor, a reward for hard work and moral rectitude. He delivered sermons that emphasized the dangers of pride and the necessity of humility, even as the town around him celebrated its technological achievements. In contrast, Dr. Alistair Finch, the town's physician, was a man of science and reason. A graduate of Harvard Medical School, Dr. Finch had come west not for wealth, but for the opportunity to study the effects of high-altitude living on human physiology. He was a man who believed that every phenomenon, no matter how mysterious, had a rational explanation rooted in the observable laws of nature. His small clinic was filled with the latest medical instruments, and his library contained volumes on everything from human anatomy to the emerging science of geology. He held a deep respect for Colonel Meade's engineering prowess, but privately worried that the town's faith in technology had made its residents blind to the unpredictable power of the natural world. These two forces, faith and science, existed in a delicate balance in Prosperity's Reach, a town that felt it had conquered the wilderness through a combination of divine blessing and human ingenuity. This fragile equilibrium would be shattered by the arrival of a single, silent orphan in the late spring of 1879. Thaddeus Crane arrived on the weekly supply wagon from Silverton, a quiet, pale boy of 12 years who seemed too frail for the harsh mountain environment. He carried a single canvas bag containing his only possessions and a letter from a distant parish explaining that his parents had died in a factory fire in St. Louis. The letter requested that the community of Prosperity's Reach take him in, as he had no other known relatives. Reverend Gable, seeing an opportunity to demonstrate the town's Christian charity, arranged for the boy to be placed with the Miller family, a young couple who had recently lost their own infant son to mountain fever. Jacob and Sarah Miller accepted the boy into their home with a mixture of pity and hope, praying that raising the orphan might help to heal the wound of their own loss. From the very beginning, Thaddeus was an unusual child. He was unnervingly quiet, speaking only when directly addressed, and even then his answers were brief and devoid of any emotion. His eyes, a pale, washed-out shade of gray, seemed to observe the world with a detached curiosity that made adults uncomfortable. He displayed none of the usual behaviors of a child who had suffered great trauma. There were no tears, no nightmares, no signs of grief. He simply existed, a quiet, watchful presence in the Millers' small cabin. Dr. Finch first encountered Thaddeus when Sarah Miller brought the boy to his clinic for a routine examination. The doctor, accustomed to the boisterous energy of mountain children, was immediately struck by the boy's stillness. Thaddeus sat perfectly motionless on the examination table, his hands folded in his lap, his gaze fixed on a point in the middle distance. His physical examination revealed nothing out of the ordinary, aside from a general paleness and a frame that was thin for his age. But Dr. Finch noted something that he could not explain medically. The air in the room seemed to grow colder around the boy, and the doctor's own pocket watch, a reliable timepiece he had carried for 15 years, stopped working the moment Thaddeus entered the clinic. It started again, perfectly on time, the moment the boy left. He recorded the incident in his journal, dismissing it as a coincidence, but the observation was the first of many that would begin to form a disturbing pattern. The first sign that something was fundamentally wrong began subtly, with a series of minor, inexplicable equipment failures. The stamp mill, a marvel of robust iron and steel, began experiencing intermittent stoppages. Gears that were perfectly lubricated would seize without warning. Pressure valves on the steam engines would stick, causing the machinery to shudder and groan in ways that made the experienced engineers uneasy. The engineers, a team of highly trained men from the East, could find no rational explanation. They disassembled the engines, checked every gear and piston, and found nothing amiss. The problems were always temporary, resolving themselves as mysteriously as they had appeared. Colonel Meade, a man who detested any suggestion of imperfection in his meticulously planned town, was furious. He blamed the engineers for incompetence and the thin mountain air for affecting the machinery's performance. No one thought to connect the malfunctions with the quiet orphan who had taken to spending his afternoons sitting on a hillside overlooking the mill, watching the massive machinery with his pale, unblinking eyes. Then, the town's clocks began to fail. Not just Dr. Finch's pocket watch, but the large regulator clock in the mining company office, the grandfather clock in Reverend Gable's rectory, and the personal timepieces of several miners. They would stop and start at random, often losing hours at a time, making it impossible for the town to run on the precise schedule that Colonel Meade demanded. The phenomenon was so widespread that the town jeweler, a German immigrant named Mr. Schmidt, was overwhelmed with repair requests. He found nothing mechanically wrong with any of the clocks. The springs were sound, the gears were clean, but they simply refused to keep accurate time. The problem became a source of constant frustration and dark humor in the town, with people joking that time itself had grown thin in the high mountain air. But Dr. Finch noticed a correlation that no one else saw. The clocks that failed most frequently were all located in buildings that Thaddeus Crane visited regularly: the church where he attended services with the Millers, the company store where he accompanied Sarah Miller for supplies, and the doctor's own clinic. The second stage of incidents involved the town's electrical systems. Prosperity's Reach boasted one of the first telephone lines in the Colorado Rockies, connecting the mine office to the stamp mill and Colonel Meade's residence. It was the colonel's pride and joy, a symbol of the town's technological superiority. In early June, the line began to crackle with static so intense that conversations became impossible. Engineers from the telegraph company were summoned from Denver. They checked the entire length of the wire, replaced the insulators, and tested the equipment, But the problem persisted. The static was not constant. It would surge and fade in unpredictable waves, often accompanied by a faint, high-pitched humming sound that set people's teeth on edge. During one particularly severe surge, the telegraph key in the main office began to spark, and the operator, a young man named Daniel Clark, received a mild electrical shock. He later told Dr. Finch that just before the surge, he had seen Thaddeus Crane standing across the street, staring at the telegraph office with that same unnerving stillness. The boy was simply watching, his expression unreadable, as if observing a scientific experiment. Dr. Finch began a new section in his journal, dedicated solely to observations of Thaddeus Crane. He started documenting every instance of equipment failure and cross-referencing it with the boy's known whereabouts. The pattern was undeniable. The problems were not random. They were concentrated in areas where Thaddeus spent significant amounts of time. The boy seemed to be a walking locus of mechanical and electrical disruption. But the theory was so outlandish, so contrary to every principle of known science, that Dr. Finch dared not voice it to anyone. How could a 12-year-old child, through his mere presence, cause iron gears to seize and electricity to run wild? The question was absurd, yet the evidence continued to mount. The incidents escalated from inconvenience to genuine danger in mid-July. The mining operation had begun work on a new, deeper shaft, employing a new steam-powered hoist to lift ore and men from the depths of the mountain. The hoist was a masterpiece of engineering, with multiple safety features, including a sophisticated brake system. One afternoon, as a cage full of miners was being lowered into the new shaft, the brake system failed completely. The cage plummeted over 100 feet before the emergency catch, a simple mechanical lock, engaged with a scream of tortured metal, stopping the cage just 50 feet from the bottom of the shaft. The men inside were terrified but unharmed, saved by a last-resort safety feature that should never have been needed. The chief engineer, a man named Marcus Thorne, was apoplectic. He personally inspected the brake mechanism, a complex system of hydraulic pistons and friction pads, and found it in perfect working order. There was no leak in the hydraulic lines, no failure in the pressure valves, no logical reason for the brakes to have disengaged, yet they had. Thorne's official report cited an unforeseeable and inexplicable pressure fluctuation, a conclusion that satisfied no one, least of all himself. But a young miner named Elias Vance, who had been operating the hoist, told a different story to Dr. Finch. Vance claimed that just before the accident, he had seen Thaddeus Crane standing near the hoist engine. The boy was not doing anything, not touching the machinery. He was simply watching. Elias had felt a sudden, intense cold wash over him, and the air had grown thick with the smell of ozone, like the air after a lightning strike. The moment the boy had turned and walked away, the brakes had failed. Dr. Finch's investigation took on a new urgency. He began to see Thaddeus not as a child, but as a problem to be solved, a medical mystery that threatened the lives of everyone in the town. He started conducting discrete experiments. He placed a calibrated compass on his desk and noted that the needle spun erratically whenever Thaddeus was in the room. He observed that a new, fully charged galvanic battery would drain completely within an hour if left near the boy. The evidence was irrefutable, yet impossible. Thaddeus Crane was passively emitting some form of energy that interfered with electromagnetic fields and mechanical systems. The community, meanwhile, began to develop its own theories, rooted in superstition and fear. The miners, a superstitious lot by nature, began to whisper that the boy was a Jonas, a bringer of bad luck. They made signs to ward off evil when he passed, and refused to work in any section of the mine where the boy had been seen. Reverend Gable, hearing these whispers, delivered a powerful sermon against superstition, arguing that the town's misfortunes were a test of their faith. He publicly defended Thaddeus, calling him a poor, unfortunate orphan who deserved their compassion, not their fear. He even invited the boy to assist him during Sunday services, a move intended to show the community that Thaddeus was a child of God. The result was a disaster. During the service, as Thaddeus stood beside Reverend Gable at the pulpit, the church's new reed organ, a source of immense community pride, began to emit a series of discordant, shrieking notes before falling completely silent. The oil lamps that lit the sanctuary flickered violently, and several of them shattered, spattering hot oil on the pews. The congregation fled in panic, their fear of the boy now cemented by what they had witnessed in the house of God itself. The incident in the church marked a turning point. The town's fear, once a collection of whispered superstitions, began to coalesce into a shared conviction. The boy was not merely unlucky, he was the source of their problems. The engineers might blame geology, and the reverend might blame a lack of faith, but the people of Prosperity's Reach had found a simpler, more terrifying explanation. Dr. Finch, watching the community's growing paranoia, knew that the situation was becoming dangerously unstable. He was caught between his scientific understanding of the phenomenon and his fear of what a terrified, isolated community might do to a child they perceived as a monster. He had to find a rational explanation, a way to understand and perhaps control the boy's strange effect on the world, before the town took matters into its own hands. The first death directly attributable to the strange phenomena occurred on a cold, clear morning in early September. The victim was Hans Schmidt, the German jeweler who had been struggling for months to understand why the town's clocks were failing. Mr. Schmidt was a meticulous craftsman and a man of science in his own right, a student of the precise and predictable world of horology. The randomness of the clock failures had deeply disturbed him, representing a violation of the mechanical order he held sacred. He had become obsessed with finding a logical cause, spending late nights in his shop, disassembling and reassembling timepieces, searching for a flaw that he could not find. He had begun to suspect, much like Dr. Finch, that the cause was not mechanical, but environmental. He had constructed a small, shielded box lined with lead, hoping to isolate a clock from whatever ambient force was affecting the others. On the morning of his death, he had been working on the large regulator clock from the mining office, a complex and beautiful instrument that he had been trying to repair for weeks. His wife, Helga Schmidt, found him slumped over his workbench, his face peaceful, but his body strangely cold. Dr. Finch was summoned immediately. His examination revealed no obvious cause of death. There were no signs of injury, no evidence of poison, no indication of a stroke or heart failure. Mr. Schmidt, a healthy man of 52 years, had simply died. But as Dr. Finch examined the scene, he noted several details that were profoundly disturbing. The regulator clock on the workbench had not simply stopped. Its internal brass gears were warped and twisted, as if they had been subjected to intense, focused heat. The small tools on the bench were all magnetized, clinging to each other with unnatural force, and inside the lead-lined box on the floor, the small test clock was running perfectly. The most chilling discovery, however, came from a witness. Young Tommy Miller, Jacob and Sarah's nephew who was visiting, told Dr. Finch that he had seen Thaddeus Crane standing outside the jeweler's shop window early that morning, just before dawn. The boy had been there for nearly an hour, motionless, watching Mr. Schmidt work. Tommy had thought it strange, but had not been frightened until he saw what he described as a shimmering in the air around Thaddeus, like the heat rising from a stovepipe. Dr. Finch's journal entry from that day was filled with a sense of escalating dread. The boy's effect is not merely disruptive, it is lethal. The energy he emanates, when focused, is capable of affecting metal at a molecular level and, it would seem, of stopping a human heart. The question is no longer what he is, but whether his effect is controlled or passive. Is he a malicious actor, or a walking, breathing natural disaster? The town of Prosperity's Reach did not wait for a scientific answer. Hans Schmidt's death, following so closely on the heels of the church incident, solidified the community's fear into something harder and more dangerous. The whispers of Jonases were replaced by the darker, more ancient word, Hexenkind, a witch child. A delegation of miners, their faces grim and set, visited Colonel Meade and demanded that the boy be sent away. Colonel Meade, a man of logic and order, was dismissive. He refused to entertain what he called medieval superstitions. He insisted that Schmidt's death was a tragic coincidence and that the town's problems stemmed from identifiable, if unusual, geological conditions. His refusal to act only deepened the rift between the town's leadership and its populace. The miners, feeling their concerns were being ignored, began to take their own precautions. They started hanging charms and religious icons on their doors, and they organized informal watches to track Thaddeus's movements, reporting his location to each other with a series of coded whistle signals. The town had become a powder keg of fear and suspicion, and Thaddeus Crane was at its center. Dr. Finch knew he was running out of time. He decided he had to confront the boy directly, to try and communicate with whatever intelligence lay behind those pale, empty eyes. He had to understand the nature of the force he was dealing with, if only to predict its next move. He found Thaddeus sitting in his usual spot on the hillside, overlooking the town, a small, still figure against the vast, indifferent backdrop of the mountains. The doctor approached slowly, his medical bag in hand, feeling more like an explorer venturing into uncharted territory than a physician making a house call. As he drew closer, he felt the familiar sensations that accompanied the boy's presence: a drop in temperature, the prickling of static electricity on his skin, and the faint, metallic taste of ozone in the air. The needle on his compass, which he held in his palm, was spinning wildly. Thaddeus did not turn as the doctor approached, but his voice, when he spoke, was clear and calm, showing no surprise. "You have questions, Dr. Finch." It was not a question, but a statement of fact. Dr. Finch stopped a few feet from the boy, his heart pounding with a mixture of fear and scientific curiosity. "Yes, Thaddeus, I do." He paused, unsure how to phrase a question about a phenomenon that defied all known language. "The clocks, the machinery, Mr. Schmidt. Are you aware of what happens when you are near?" Thaddeus finally turned his head, and his pale gray eyes met the doctor's. For the first time, Dr. Finch saw something in them beyond simple detachment. It was not emotion, but a vast, ancient, and utterly alien intelligence. "Awareness implies separation," the boy said, his voice a flat, uninflected monotone. "I do not cause the effect, I am the effect. The pattern is inherent to my presence." The doctor struggled to comprehend the boy's words. "What pattern? What are you?" Thaddeus turned his gaze back toward the town below. He raised a small, pale hand and pointed toward the stamp mill. "That system is complex. It operates on principles of pressure, heat, and mechanical stress. My presence introduces a variable it cannot account for. It disrupts the established order." He then pointed toward the telegraph office. "That system operates on principles of electrical harmony. My presence is discord. It creates noise where there should be signal. Finally," he gestured toward the town itself. "That system operates on principles of social cohesion, shared beliefs, and predictable behavior. My presence is an anomaly. It creates fear where there was order." Dr. Finch felt a profound chill that had nothing to do with the mountain air. The boy was describing himself as a fundamental force, a living entropy that passively degraded complex systems, whether they were mechanical, electrical, or social. He was not a witch, not a demon, but something far more terrifying, a flaw in the fabric of reality itself. "Mr. Schmidt," the doctor began, his voice barely a whisper, "did you intend for him to die?" Thaddeus considered the question for a long moment before answering. "Intention is a function of desire. I do not desire." He was a system of complex biological and electrical processes. He dedicated his focus to creating order. My proximity overwhelmed his system's ability to maintain that order. His heart, like the gears in his clocks, was a complex machine. It failed. The clinical detachment of the boy's explanation was more horrifying than any confession of malice could have been. Thaddeus felt no guilt because he felt no agency. He was a storm, a flood, an earthquake, a natural disaster in human form, and like any natural disaster, his potential for destruction was immense. As the doctor stood on that hillside, grappling with the terrible revelation, he saw a group of men emerging from the mine entrance below. They were carrying lanterns, though it was still daylight, and their movements were tense and purposeful. It was the miners' watch. They had seen the doctor with the boy and were coming to investigate. Dr. Finch knew in that moment that the fragile order of Prosperity's Reach was about to break completely. He had to get the boy away, not just to protect the town, but to protect the boy from the town. But as he looked at Thaddeus's calm, impassive face, he had the sudden, terrifying thought that perhaps the boy had known the miners were coming all along, that he had calculated this confrontation with the same dispassionate precision he applied to everything else. The situation in Prosperity's Reach deteriorated rapidly, following Dr. Finch's confrontation with Thaddeus on the hillside. The miners who had seen them together reported back to the town, their story embellished with each telling. They spoke of the air shimmering around the boy, of the doctor looking pale and shaken, of an unnatural silence that had fallen over the mountain. The community's fear, which had been simmering for weeks, finally boiled over. That evening, a mob of nearly 50 men, led by a burly mine foreman named Jedediah Strong, marched to the Miller cabin. They were armed with mining tools and hunting rifles, their faces illuminated by the flickering light of torches, their voices a low, angry rumble that echoed through the valley. They demanded that Jacob Miller hand over the boy. Jacob, a gentleman who had tried to show Thaddeus kindness, stood in his doorway, his body trembling but his resolve firm. He refused, telling the men that Thaddeus was just a child and that they should be ashamed of themselves. His bravery was met with a shower of rocks thrown against the cabin walls. Inside, Sarah Miller held Thaddeus, who remained as calm and detached as ever, his pale eyes watching the scene unfold as if it were a play being performed for his benefit. Dr. Finch arrived just as the mob was preparing to break down the door. He rode his horse directly into the crowd, his voice ringing with an authority that even the angriest miners respected. He told them that the boy was under his medical care, and that any harm done to him would be considered a criminal act. His intervention, along with the timely arrival of Colonel Meade and a small contingent of armed company guards, was enough to disperse the mob, but the incident left the town dangerously fractured. The next morning, a council was held in Colonel Meade's office. The colonel, his face a mask of grim frustration, listened as Dr. Finch explained his findings. He described the electromagnetic phenomena, the inexplicable equipment failures, and his conversation with Thaddeus. He presented his theory that the boy was not malicious, but was the source of a passive, disruptive field of energy. Colonel Meade, a man of unshakable rationalism, struggled to accept the doctor's conclusions. "Alistair, what you're describing is impossible," he argued. "It violates every known law of physics. There must be a geological explanation, some form of magnetic ore deep in the mountain that is causing these disturbances. And what of the boy's own words?" Dr. Finch countered. "What of his impossible knowledge of engineering and physics? How do you explain that?" Before the colonel could answer, Reverend Gable offered his own interpretation. He argued that the boy was possessed, that a demonic entity was using the child's body as a vessel to sow chaos and test the faith of the community. He proposed an exorcism, a ritual that he believed would drive the evil spirit from the boy and restore order to the town. The meeting devolved into a heated argument between the three men, each representing a different worldview, each trying to impose his own framework of understanding on a phenomenon that seemed to defy them all. While they debated, the very force they were discussing was about to escalate its passive war on their world in the most catastrophic way imaginable. The town's water was supplied by a massive steam-powered pump located a mile up the valley. It drew water from a deep mountain aquifer and pushed it through a network of iron pipes to the town and the stamp mill. The pump was Colonel Meade's greatest engineering achievement, a testament to his ability to impose order on the wilderness. It was the town's lifeline. On the afternoon of the council meeting, the pump exploded. It was not a simple mechanical failure, but a complete, catastrophic disintegration. The massive boiler ruptured with the force of a cannon, sending shrapnel and scalding steam hundreds of feet into the air. The explosion triggered a landslide that dammed the creek, and the resulting flood of water and debris swept down the valley, destroying the aqueduct system and wiping out a section of the main road. The sound of the explosion echoed through the mountains, a deafening roar that brought the entire town running from their homes. They watched in horror as a column of black smoke rose from the valley, marking the death of their most vital piece of technology. 2 men who had been performing maintenance on the pump were killed instantly. Their bodies were never fully recovered. In the aftermath of the explosion, a search party was sent to the pump house. Among the twisted metal and splintered wood, they found a small canvas bag. It belonged to Thaddeus Crane. Jacob and Sarah Miller, in a state of shock, confirmed that the boy had left the cabin an hour before the explosion, saying he was going for a walk. He had not been seen since. The discovery of the bag was all the proof the town needed. The debate between science, faith, and superstition was over. In the minds of the people of Prosperity's Reach, the pump's destruction was a deliberate act of sabotage, the final, undeniable proof of the boy's malevolent nature. Colonel Meade, his face pale with the shock of seeing his greatest creation destroyed, finally conceded that the situation was beyond his control. He authorized Dr. Finch and a small party of his most trusted guards to find the boy and bring him back, by any means necessary. He gave the doctor one clear, chilling instruction. The phenomenon had to be contained. Dr. Finch knew that this was not a rescue mission, it was a hunt. He also knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that Thaddeus had likely anticipated this outcome. The boy was not lost in the wilderness, he was waiting. He had chosen the time and place for the final confrontation. The search party tracked Thaddeus for 2 days, following a trail that was unnervingly easy to find. The boy seemed to be leaving a deliberate path, heading deeper into the most rugged and inaccessible part of the mountains. Along the way, the party experienced a series of bizarre and terrifying phenomena. Their compasses became useless, spinning in random circles. Their rifles misfired, and their lanterns flickered and died, even with full reservoirs of oil. The men grew increasingly unnerved, their sense of being the hunters slowly replaced by the feeling that they were being led into a trap. They found Thaddeus on the 3rd day, at the entrance to an old, abandoned silver mine, a place known to the local Ute tribes as the Cave of Whispering Winds. The boy was sitting on a rock at the mouth of the cave, waiting for them, his face as calm and impassive as ever. As Dr. Finch and his men approached, the air grew thick and heavy, and the scent of ozone was so strong it was almost suffocating. The rocks around the cave entrance hummed with a low, vibrant energy, and small pebbles levitated a few inches off the ground, dancing in the air as if suspended in water. The men's hair stood on end, and their metal belt buckles and rifle barrels grew uncomfortably warm. "This is far enough, Doctor," Thaddeus said, his voice strangely amplified by the cave's acoustics. "The concentration is too high here for your systems to remain stable." Dr. Finch ordered his men to stay back and approach the boy alone. He had to understand the final piece of the puzzle. "Why, Thaddeus? Why the pump? Why lead us here?" The boy looked at the doctor, and for a fleeting moment, Finch thought he saw a flicker of something akin to sadness in those pale gray eyes. The pump was the heart of the system. Its complexity was a source of instability. Its destruction was inevitable. I merely chose the timing. He gestured toward the cave behind him. "This place is different. The rock is ancient. The systems are simple. There is a natural balance here. My presence has less effect." Dr. Finch realized the terrifying truth. Thaddeus had not led them there to be captured. He had led them there to show them the only solution. He could not be cured. He could not be controlled. He could only be isolated. He was choosing his own exile. "You want to stay here, alone?" the doctor asked, his voice filled with a strange mix of horror and pity. "I am not alone," Thaddeus said, and he gestured again toward the darkness of the cave. "There are other patterns in here, older ones. They do not conflict with mine." At that moment, a deep, resonant humming sound began to emanate from the mouth of the cave, a sound that was not just heard, but felt deep in the bones. The levitating pebbles began to spin faster, and the air crackled with visible sparks of static electricity. The guards, terrified, raised their rifles. "Don't shoot!" Dr. Finch yelled, but it was too late. One of the men, his nerve broken, fired a shot. The bullet never reached the boy. It stopped in midair, a few feet from his chest, and then simply disintegrated into a cloud of fine metallic dust. Thaddeus stood up, his small form silhouetted against the pulsing energy of the cave mouth. He gave Dr. Finch one last, long look, an expression that the doctor would spend the rest of his life trying to decipher. Then, without another word, he turned and walked into the darkness of the cave. As soon as he was gone, the phenomena ceased. The air cleared, the humming stopped, and the pebbles fell to the ground. The world returned to normal, but it was a normal that was now haunted by the knowledge of what it had briefly contained. Dr. Finch and his men stood in stunned silence, staring at the empty cave entrance. They made no attempt to follow. They knew, with absolute certainty, that the world inside that cave was no longer a place where men could safely go. The party returned to Prosperity's Reach with their story. The town, relieved to be rid of the boy, accepted the tale of his strange exile. The official report stated that the orphan Thaddeus Crane had perished in the wilderness, lost to the elements. It was a lie that everyone tacitly agreed to believe, a necessary fiction to close a chapter that no one could comprehend. The final call to action should be inserted here, as the emotional payoff and resolution of the central mystery has occurred. What do you think became of Thaddeus Crane in that cave? Do you believe he was a natural phenomenon, or something else entirely? Share your theories in the comments below. We read every single one and are fascinated by the insights of our community. If you found this journey into one of America's strangest historical mysteries compelling, please hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and share this story with someone else who appreciates the deep, dark corners of history. Your support allows us to continue unearthing these forgotten tales. The town of Prosperity's Reach did not survive the loss of its pump. Without a steady supply of water, the stamp mill could not operate, and without the mill, the silver ore was worthless. The investors from the East, spooked by the reports of catastrophic and inexplicable equipment failures, pulled their funding. By the winter of 1880, the town was all but abandoned. Colonel Jefferson Meade, his dreams of a technological empire in ruins, was one of the last to leave. He died a broken man a few years later, his name a forgotten footnote in the history of the Colorado silver boom. Reverend Michael Gable returned to the East, his faith shaken to its core. He spent the rest of his life writing theological treatises on the nature of evil, trying to reconcile his belief in a benevolent God with the memory of the silent, pale-eyed boy who had dismantled a town without lifting a finger. Dr. Alistair Finch was the only one who remained. He lived as a recluse in the abandoned town for another 20 years, continuing his research and filling dozens of journals with his observations and theories about the Crane phenomenon. He believed that Thaddeus was not unique, but was a rare manifestation of a fundamental force of the universe, a human singularity whose existence challenged the very foundations of science. His journals, discovered in his abandoned clinic after his death in 1900, were initially dismissed as the ramblings of an eccentric old man. But in the later 20th century, as theoretical physics began to explore concepts of quantum entanglement, alternate dimensions, and the observer effect, some scientists revisited Dr. Finch's work. They found his meticulous, first-hand observations of a force that could warp physical laws to be both terrifying and eerily prescient. The Cave of Whispering Winds was eventually sealed by a rockslide in the early 1900s, its secrets locked away forever. The ruins of Prosperity's Reach were slowly reclaimed by the mountains, its proud brick buildings crumbling under the weight of snow and time, until all that remained was a ghost town, haunted by the memory of a dream that had been broken by a reality it could not comprehend. The story of Thaddeus Crane serves as a chilling reminder that there may be forces in the universe that operate outside our understanding, anomalies that our science cannot measure and our faith cannot explain. It suggests that the orderly, predictable world we build for ourselves with our technology and our laws may be a far more fragile construction than we imagine, and that sometimes the greatest threat to that order can come in the smallest, most innocent-seeming form. Dr. Alistair Finch did not see it as a suggestion, but as a diagnosis. For him, the world had revealed a symptom, a deep and terrifying pathology in the very structure of existence, and he, as a man of science, was now duty-bound to study it. While the others who fled the corpse of Prosperity's Reach sought to forget, Dr. Finch sought to understand. He did not follow the others back to the relative safety of Denver or the bustling cities of the East. Instead, he journeyed to Leadville, another Colorado mining town perched even higher in the mountains, a place teeming with the same volatile mixture of ambition, technology, and humanity that had defined Prosperity's Reach. He did not go there to practice medicine or to seek his fortune. He went there to observe. He had developed a terrible new hypothesis. If Thaddeus Crane was not a singular aberration but a recurring type of human phenomenon, then other such catalysts must exist, and they would inevitably be drawn to or arise within environments of maximum complexity and energy, places where their disruptive influence would be most profound. Leadville, in 1880, was the most complex and energetic place on the continent. Its mines produced staggering amounts of silver, its streets were a chaotic swirl of a dozen languages, and its saloons and theaters blazed with light and noise deep into the frozen nights. It was a perfect laboratory. Dr. Finch took a small, unassuming room above a bakery, his window overlooking the ceaseless traffic of State Street. He no longer practiced medicine, living frugally off the savings he had accumulated. His life became a singular, obsessive pursuit. He spent his days in the town's library, poring over stacks of newspapers from across the country, searching for patterns. He was not looking for stories of hauntings or monsters. He was looking for data. He searched for reports of towns that had failed without clear economic or environmental cause, for industrial accidents that defied engineering analysis, for sudden outbreaks of social hysteria in otherwise stable communities. He created vast charts, cross-referencing dates, locations, and types of phenomena, looking for the signature of another catalyst. His nights were spent walking the streets of Leadville, observing. He watched the massive hoist engines lifting ore from the depths of Friar Hill. He noted the flickering of the new electric streetlights. He listened to the hum of the telegraph wires, and he watched the people. He was no longer just a physician studying human physiology. He had become a diagnostician of reality itself, searching for the first subtle symptoms of the entropic disease he had witnessed in Prosperity's Reach. For 2 years, he found nothing. Leadville boomed and brawled. Its machinery functioned within expected parameters, and its social order, while chaotic, did not unravel. He began to fear that his experience had been unique, a singular madness that he had mistaken for a universal law. His journals from this period are filled with self-doubt and the gnawing fear that he had sacrificed his career and his sanity to chase a phantom. But in the autumn of 1882, he found a pattern. It was not in Colorado, but thousands of miles away, in the dense, fog-shrouded forests of the Washington Territory. A story in a San Francisco newspaper, which he had acquired from a traveling merchant, described the inexplicable collapse of a major logging operation on the slopes of Mount Rainier in the late 1860s. The company, one of the best equipped on the West Coast, had been abandoned after a series of bizarre and catastrophic events. State-of-the-art steam-powered donkey engines used for hauling logs had malfunctioned repeatedly, their steel cables snapping under loads they should have handled with ease. The company's sawmill, a model of modern efficiency, had been plagued by saw blades that would warp or shatter for no discernible reason. The incidents had culminated in the collapse of a newly constructed railway trestle, an event that had killed 6 men and bankrupted the company. The official investigation had blamed shoddy materials and poor engineering, but the article mentioned that the loggers themselves had different theories. They spoke of a strange silence that would fall over the forest, of tools that would grow intensely cold to the touch, and of a pervasive sense of being watched. They had abandoned the camp en masse, leaving millions of board feet of valuable timber to rot on the mountainside. The story was nearly 15 years old, but the details were so eerily familiar that Dr. Finch felt the old, cold certainty return. The mention of inexplicable mechanical failure, the environmental anomalies, the creeping social paranoia was the signature. He sold the few possessions he had, bought a train ticket west, and began the long journey to the misty, green wilderness of the Pacific Northwest. He arrived in the small town of Carbonado, a settlement built on coal and timber at the foot of the Great Mountain, in the spring of 1883. The logging camp from the newspaper story, known as Blackwood Camp, was long abandoned, a place already being swallowed by the relentless growth of the forest. The locals spoke of it in hushed tones, calling it a cursed place where the trees themselves held a grudge against men. Finch hired a local guide, a grizzled former trapper named Silas Croft, a man old enough to remember the days of Blackwood Camp's brief and disastrous existence. Silas was a man of few words, but he knew the mountains, and for a price, he was willing to guide the strange, intense doctor from Colorado into the whispering woods. As they made their way up the overgrown logging roads, Silas spoke of the camp's history. He described the arrival of the Big Eastern Company with its fancy machines and its arrogant engineers who believed they could tame the forest. And he spoke of the girl. Her name was Elspeth, he recalled. She had been an orphan, much like Thaddeus, who had been taken in by the camp's blacksmith and his wife. She was a small, silent child with hair the color of flax and eyes as gray as the winter sky. No one knew where she had come from, only that she had arrived with a group of settlers whose wagon had broken down on the Neches Trail. She was a quiet one, Silas Croft recounted as they rested by a stream, his voice a low, gravelly rumble. Never played with the other children, just sat and watched. Mostly she'd watch the machines. She'd sit on a stump for hours, just watching the donkey engines haul the logs. The loggers said it was unnatural, the way she watched, like she was waiting for something. Dr. Finch's hand tightened on the journal in his coat pocket. The parallels were becoming too strong to ignore. What kind of things happened, Silas? The old trapper spat a stream of tobacco juice onto a fern. Everything that could go wrong did. The cables on the donkey engines would snap, clean as a whistle, sending 1,000-pound logs crashing down the mountain. The sawmill blades, finest Sheffield steel, they'd shatter like glass. Men started getting hurt. A tree fell the wrong way, crushing a man. A boiler exploded, scalding 2 others. It wasn't just bad luck. It was like the laws of the world got thin up there. Silas paused, his eyes distant with memory. And there was the cold. You'd be working, sweating in the summer sun, and suddenly a patch of cold would move over you, cold like a cellar in January. The tools would get so cold they'd stick to your hands. The loggers, they started saying it was the girl, that she brought the cold with her, that she was the reason the machines were fighting back. When they finally reached the site of Blackwood Camp, Dr. Finch found a scene of eerie preservation and rapid decay. The massive, rust-eaten hulks of the donkey engines stood half-swallowed by ferns and moss, silent iron behemoths that had been defeated by a force they were not designed to resist. The collapsed railway trestle lay in a heap of rotting timbers at the bottom of a ravine, a monument to a disaster that had no logical cause. Finch spent a week at the site, taking detailed notes and making sketches. He found evidence that corroborated everything Silas had told him. He examined the snapped steel cables, and found that the brakes were crystalline and clean, not frayed as they would be from normal stress. It suggested a sudden, molecular-level failure, not a gradual weakening. He found one of the shattered sawmill blades, and the fractures in the metal radiated from the center in a perfect, starburst pattern, as if the blade had been struck by an immense, focused vibration. He was documenting a second case study, another instance of a human catalyst whose presence warped the physical world. But he needed to know what had become of the girl, Elspeth. Silas Croft was reluctant to speak of it. It was a dark chapter in the region's history, one that most people had chosen to forget. But Dr. Finch's quiet intensity was persuasive, and as they sat by their campfire on the last night, the old guide finally told him the rest of the story. After the trestle collapse, the loggers had become a mob, much like the miners of Prosperity's Reach. They were convinced that Elspeth was the source of their misfortune, that she was a witch who had cursed the camp. They had gone to the blacksmith's cabin, armed with axes and peaveys. The blacksmith, a large and powerful man named John Carter, had tried to defend the girl. He had stood in the doorway, an axe in his hand, and told the men they would have to kill him to get to her. And did they? Dr. Finch asked, his voice low. Silas Croft poked the fire with a stick, his face grim in the dancing light. They did. 3 of them rushed him at once. He took one of them down with him, but it was no use. They beat him to death right there on his own doorstep. His wife went mad with grief, ran screaming into the woods, and was never seen again. The old guide fell silent, the only sound the crackling of the fire and the sigh of the wind in the giant fir trees. And the girl, Elspeth? Silas looked up, and his eyes held a deep, ancient sadness. They took her. The foreman, a man named Macready, he said they had to break the curse. They dragged her to the oldest tree in the valley, a giant cedar that the native tribes called the spirit tree. They believed that what the forest had sent, the forest could take back. He paused, and his voice dropped to a pained whisper. They didn't bury her. They sealed her inside it. There was a hollow at the base of the tree, a big one. They forced her inside and then walled it up with rocks and clay. They said they could hear her in there for 3 days, not crying or screaming, just counting. Dr. Finch felt a wave of nausea and a profound, professional coldness. Thaddeus had been allowed to choose his exile. Elspeth had been entombed. The human response to the anomaly, when left to its own devices, was not investigation or containment, but brutal, superstitious eradication. The next morning, Silas led him to the tree. It was an ancient red cedar, a titan of the forest, its trunk easily 15 feet in diameter. At its base, there was a section of the bark that was discolored, and a mass of rocks and hardened clay, now covered in moss, was still visible, sealing a large hollow. There was no marker, no sign of what had been done there. but the air around the tree was still, silent, and unnervingly cold. Finch stood before the giant cedar for a long time, his mind racing. He was no longer just a scientist documenting a strange phenomenon. He was now the chronicler of a hidden history, a secret war between these strange human catalysts and the societies that could not tolerate their existence. He now understood that his work was not merely academic, it was dangerous. The knowledge he possessed was a threat, not just to his own peace of mind, but to the fragile social order that would do anything, commit any atrocity, to protect itself from a truth it could not comprehend. His quest had changed. It was no longer enough to simply understand. He had to find another, a living one, before a terrified community found them first. He had to intervene. The thought was both terrifying and exhilarating. He, Alistair Finch, a man of medicine and reason, would become a guardian, a protector of the very forces that dismantled the world. He left the Washington Territory with a new, heavier purpose. His journals were no longer just a record of past events. They were a field guide to a species that did not know it existed, and a warning about the one predator it could not defend itself against: humanity. His search took him east, across the arid plains of the Dakotas, and into the rolling farm country of the Midwest. He followed whispers and rumors, chasing down stories of blighted crops that had no agricultural explanation, of communities that had turned on themselves with sudden, inexplicable violence, of machinery that failed in defiance of all logic. Most were dead ends, simple tragedies misremembered or embellished over time. But he was patient. He knew the signature now, and he knew how to look for it. In the winter of 1887, he found his third case. It was in a small, isolated religious commune in rural Iowa called the Congregation of the New Dawn. The congregation was a group of German pietists who had separated themselves from the modern world to live a life of simple agriculture and intense spiritual devotion. They were a closed society, deeply suspicious of outsiders. Dr. Finch learned of them through a brief article in a Des Moines newspaper that described the community's sudden and near-total economic collapse. They had been renowned for their agricultural productivity, their meticulously maintained barns and their herds of prize-winning livestock. But over the course of a single year, their fortunes had reversed completely. Their crops had failed, their animals had sickened and died, and their complex irrigation systems had ceased to function. The report blamed a series of droughts and a localized cattle plague, but Finch knew that such a rapid and total collapse often had a different kind of catalyst. Gaining access to the commune was nearly impossible. They rebuffed his initial inquiries, their leader, a stern patriarch named Elder Jacob, sending word that they had no need of help from the outside world. Finch knew he could not force his way in. He had to be patient, to observe from a distance, just as Thaddeus and Elspeth had done. He took a room in a boarding house in the nearest town, a dusty railway stop some 20 miles from the commune. He introduced himself as a historian studying agrarian communities, a plausible cover that allowed him to ask questions without arousing too much suspicion. The townspeople knew little about the congregation, seeing them as a strange, standoffish sect, but they confirmed the stories of their sudden misfortune. They also spoke of the children. The congregation had many children, but there was one who was different. They didn't know his name, but they had seen him on the rare occasions when the commune members came to town for supplies. He was a boy of about 10 years, with dark, watchful eyes and a habit of humming to himself, a strange, dissonant tune that seemed to have no melody. The town's blacksmith, a man named George Peterson, told Finch a story that made the doctor's blood run cold. One day, the boy had been in his shop with his father. While the father was negotiating a price for steel plowshares, the boy had stood staring intently at the forge. Peterson said the fire in the forge had begun to burn strangely, the flames turning a sickly green and purple, and the heat becoming so intense that it warped a new anvil he had just installed. The boy had just kept humming his tune, a smile on his face, as if enjoying the strange spectacle. The signature was there, but this time it was different. Thaddeus's effect had been electromagnetic and mechanical. Elspeth seemed to have been primarily mechanical and environmental. This boy's influence appeared to be chemical and thermal. Dr. Finch realized that the phenomenon was not uniform. Each catalyst manifested their disruptive properties in a unique way, like a disease with multiple, distinct strains. This new case presented a different kind of danger. A catalyst who could influence heat and chemical reactions was, in many ways, far more dangerous than one who merely stopped clocks or broke machines. He could start fires, spoil food, poison water, and create diseases. Finch redoubled his efforts to get inside the commune. He spent weeks studying their routines, observing their movements from a hill overlooking their valley, using a powerful spyglass. He charted their comings and goings, their planting schedules, their prayer times. He was using the catalyst's own methods against them. His break came in the form of a medical emergency. One of the commune's children suffered a severe injury, a fall from a barn loft, and their own herbal remedies were proving insufficient. Desperate, Elder Jakob sent a rider to town for the local doctor, who happened to be away on a call. Finch seized the opportunity. He presented himself as a visiting physician from Denver, offering his assistance. His calm demeanor and obvious medical knowledge convinced the desperate father, and he was finally granted entry into the closed world of the New Dawn. The commune was a place of stark, disciplined order. The houses were identical, the fields were laid out in perfect geometric patterns, and the people moved with a quiet, synchronized purpose. But beneath the surface of this rigid order, Finch could feel the palpable tension of a system under stress. The people were gaunt, their crops were withered, and their barns, once a source of pride, were in a state of disrepair. After successfully setting the injured child's broken leg, earning a measure of trust from Elder Jakob, Finch was allowed to stay for a few days to monitor the patient. This gave him the chance he needed to find the boy. His name was Jonah. He was the elder's own son. Finch found him in a small, isolated cabin at the edge of the property, a place the others seemed to avoid. Jonah was not a prisoner, but he was clearly an outcast. He sat on the floor, surrounded by patterns he had made from colored stones and dried leaves, humming his tuneless song. When Finch entered, the boy looked up, and his dark eyes held a knowing intelligence that was chillingly familiar. But unlike Thaddeus, there was no emptiness in Jonah's eyes. There was a spark of something else, something that looked like curiosity, and perhaps even malice. "You are not a historian," Jonah said, his voice a low, musical hum. "You are a collector. You look for people like me." Dr. Finch was taken aback by the boy's directness. Thaddeus had been a passive force, Elspeth a silent victim. Jonah was something new. He was aware. He understood what he was. "I am a doctor," Finch replied carefully. "I study things that are not understood." Jonah smiled, a small, knowing smile that did not reach his eyes. "They believe I am a punishment from God for their pride. They think their crops fail and their animals die because my soul is impure." He gestured to the withered fields outside the window. "They are not wrong about the cause, only about the reason." He picked up a perfectly healthy green leaf from the floor. He held it in his palm, and as he hummed his strange tune, the leaf began to wither. It turned brown, curled at the edges, and crumbled into dust, all in the space of a minute. "I change things," Jonah said simply. "I can make living things decay. I can make fire burn hotter. I can make water sour. It is my nature." Dr. Finch felt a thrill of pure, terrifying scientific revelation. He was speaking with the phenomenon itself. This was the breakthrough he had been searching for, a chance to understand the source, the mechanism, the consciousness behind the chaos. "Can you control it?" Finch asked, his voice hushed with awe. Jonah's smile widened. "Control is a limitation. I do not control. I encourage. I find the potential for decay in a thing, the potential for chaos in a system, and I encourage it to express itself. Your world is so full of things just waiting to fall apart, Doctor. It is the easiest thing in the world to give them a little push." In that moment, Dr. Finch understood that he had made a terrible miscalculation. He had come to the commune believing he needed to protect a child from a fearful community. He now realized that he might have to protect a community from a child who was not a passive catalyst, but an active, intelligent, and malevolent agent of decay. The situation was far more dangerous than he had ever imagined. He was not dealing with a natural disaster, but with a conscious will, a being who enjoyed the unraveling of order, who saw destruction as a form of art. And as he looked into Jonah's dark, knowing eyes, he saw that the boy was now studying him, assessing his weaknesses, calculating the easiest way to make him fall apart. He had found his third specimen, but he had also found his first true adversary. The game had changed. He was no longer the observer. He was now a participant, and he had the terrifying feeling that he was already losing. Elder Jakob, despite his deep suspicion of the outside world, was a man who respected knowledge and competence. Dr. Finch's successful treatment of the injured child had earned him a precarious but valuable position of trust within the commune. He was allowed to remain for an extended period, ostensibly to oversee the child's recovery and to offer general medical advice to a community that had long been without a physician. This gave him the opportunity to study Jonah, but it was an opportunity fraught with peril. He was in a closed system with a being who could manipulate the very chemistry of life and matter, and who was fully aware of the doctor's true purpose. Their interactions became a delicate, high-stakes dance of intellect and will. Finch would visit Jonah in his cabin under the pretense of medical observation, engaging the boy in long conversations about his abilities. Jonah, in turn, seemed to enjoy the attention, treating the doctor as a peer, an appreciative audience for his unique talents. He would demonstrate his abilities in small, controlled ways, causing a cup of water to grow cloudy and foul, making a piece of iron rust in minutes, or accelerating the wilting of a cut flower. "Everything carries the seed of its own corruption, Doctor," Jonah explained during one of these sessions, his voice a low, melodic hum. "All I do is help that seed to sprout. Order is a temporary state, an unnatural effort against the true tendency of the universe. The true state is dissolution. I am simply an agent of the truth." Finch tried to understand the source of Jonah's power, to find a scientific framework for it. He theorized about focused enzymatic reactions, about the projection of specific frequencies of energy that could disrupt molecular bonds. He filled his journal with complex diagrams and speculative equations, trying to map the physics of decay, but he knew his attempts were like trying to measure a hurricane with a teaspoon. Jonah's abilities were not just a matter of physics, they were an extension of his will. Unlike Thaddeus, whose effect was a constant, passive field, Jonah could focus his power. He could choose his targets. This became terrifyingly clear one afternoon, when a man in the commune named Brother Daniel openly challenged Elder Jakob's authority, arguing that their misfortunes were a sign that the elder had lost God's favor. The argument took place in the central meeting house, and it was a serious breach of the commune's rigid social order. That evening, Brother Daniel fell violently ill. His symptoms were unlike any disease Dr. Finch had ever witnessed. His skin became covered in weeping sores, his hair fell out in clumps, and he was racked with a fever that did not respond to any treatment. He died in agony 3 days later. Dr. Finch knew, with a certainty that made his soul ache, that Jonah was responsible. He confronted the boy in his cabin. Brother Daniel's death was not a natural illness, was it? Jonah did not deny it. He simply smiled. He was a source of discord. He threatened the system. The system removed him. It is the way of things. You killed him, Finch said, his voice a hoarse whisper. I encouraged the potential for sickness that already existed within him, Jonah corrected gently. His body was a complex system. I simply introduced a new variable. His system failed to adapt. It was a fascinating process to observe. Dr. Finch felt a cold dread settle in his heart. He was in the presence of a being who combined the destructive potential of a plague with the cold, calculating intellect of a research scientist. Jonah was not just a catalyst. He was an artist, and his medium was decay. The doctor realized that his own life was in grave danger. He had seen too much, understood too much. To Jonah, he was no longer just an interesting conversationalist. He was a potential threat to his own existence, a source of order and analysis that had to be neutralized. Finch began to experience subtle signs of Jonah's influence. His food would taste faintly sour. His ink would clog in his pen. The pages of his journal would feel brittle and old. These were warnings, small demonstrations of power, reminders that Jonah could reach him at any time, in any way he chose. He knew he had to leave the commune, but he could not simply walk away. Jonah would not permit it. The boy would see his departure as a threat, and would likely act to prevent it in the most permanent way possible. Furthermore, Finch could not, in good conscience, leave the rest of the commune at the mercy of the boy. He had a duty, as a doctor and as a human being, to do something. His plan was desperate and wildly dangerous. He had to turn Jonah's own nature against him. He had observed that Jonah, for all his power, was still a child in some ways. He was arrogant, confident in his superiority, and he craved an audience who could appreciate his unique genius. Finch decided to become that audience, but with a twist. He began to praise Jonah's abilities, not just as a scientist, but as a theologian. He started to frame Jonah's power not as a force of nature, but as a divine gift, a sign that Jonah himself was a new prophet, a being chosen by God to demonstrate the true entropic nature of the universe. "You are not just a catalyst, Jonah," Finch said one evening, his voice filled with feigned awe. "You are a revelation. You are the living embodiment of the holy principle of dissolution. Your existence is a sacred text that proves the vanity of all human effort." Jonah, who had been raised in a culture of intense religious belief, was intrigued. The idea appealed to his sense of superiority and his desire for a grander purpose. He had always seen himself as a superior being, and Finch was now giving him a theological framework for that belief. Finch's plan was to build up Jonah's messianic ego to a point where he would feel compelled to give a grand demonstration of his power, a sermon of decay that would be so spectacular it would expose him to the entire commune. The doctor began to suggest targets for this sermon, not people, which would be too dangerous, but the commune's most prized possession, their great barn. The barn was the heart of the new dawn, a massive structure built with meticulous craftsmanship, a symbol of their faith in order and productivity. "If you could show them the truth of decay," Finch suggested, "if you could make them see the inherent corruption in their most perfect creation, they would have no choice but to accept your divinity." Jonah was captivated by the idea. The barn represented everything he despised: order, stability, and the illusion of permanence. To bring it down, to make it rot and crumble before the eyes of its creators, would be the ultimate expression of his power and his philosophy. He agreed. He set the date for his demonstration for the night of the next new moon, a time he felt was cosmically appropriate. Dr. Finch now had a timeline. He spent the intervening 2 weeks in a state of high alert, his every nerve stretched to the breaking point. He had to secretly warn the community and prepare them for what was coming, without tipping off Jonah. He used his medical authority as a cover. He told Elder Jakob that he had detected signs of a dangerous structural fungus in the barn's main support beams. He claimed that the wood was becoming unstable and that the barn needed to be evacuated of all livestock and valuable equipment for safety. He described the potential for a sudden, catastrophic collapse with such clinical detail and conviction that the elder, already unnerved by the community's recent misfortunes, agreed. On the night of the new moon, the entire commune gathered at a safe distance from the barn, drawn by Elder Jakob's command and Finch's dire warnings. They watched in fearful silence as Jonah walked alone toward the massive structure. Dr. Finch stood with Elder Jakob, his heart pounding so hard he feared it would burst. His gamble was about to play out. Jonah stood before the barn, his small form barely visible in the darkness. He began to hum his strange, dissonant song. At first, nothing happened. But then, a low groaning sound began to emanate from the barn, the sound of wood under immense, unnatural stress. The massive support beams, made from 100-year-old oak, began to visibly twist and warp. The roof shingles curled and cracked. The walls began to bow outwards, and a fine gray dust, the dust of impossibly rapid decay, began to pour from the seams. Within 10 minutes, the entire structure, a building that should have stood for a century, collapsed into a pile of rotten, splintered wood. It did not fall with a crash, but with a soft, final sigh, like a living thing expiring. The commune watched in stunned, horrified silence. They had just witnessed a miracle of destruction, a divine or demonic act that defied all rational explanation. In the silence that followed the barn's collapse, Jonah turned to face them, a triumphant smile on his face. He expected to see awe and worship. He expected them to fall to their knees before their new prophet of decay. But what he saw was terror. He saw faces filled not with reverence, but with a deep, primal fear of the unnatural. He had revealed his true nature, and the response was not adoration, but revulsion. It was in that moment that Dr. Finch made his move. He stepped forward and spoke to the crowd, his voice clear and steady. "You have seen the source of your misfortune," he declared, pointing to Jonah. "It is not a curse from God. It is a sickness, a natural phenomenon that we do not understand. The boy is not evil, but his effect on the world is. He cannot be cured, but he can be contained." Elder Jakob, his face a mask of grief for his son and his lost faith, turned to Finch. "What must we do, doctor?" Finch looked at Jonah, who was now standing alone, his triumphant smile gone, replaced by a look of confusion and dawning fury. The boy had miscalculated. He had not understood that humanity's deepest instinct is not to worship chaos, but to fight it. "There is a place," Finch said, thinking of the cave in the San Juan Mountains. "An old salt mine, 2 days' journey from here. The geology is stable, inert. The salt will inhibit his effect on organic matter. He can be isolated there, kept safe, and kept from harming others." The decision was made. A small group of the commune's strongest men, led by Finch and a heartbroken Elder Jakob, would transport Jonah to the salt mine. The journey was a silent, tense affair. Jonah did not fight or struggle. He sat in the back of the wagon, wrapped in canvas to dampen his effect, his eyes burning with a cold, hateful fire. He now saw Dr. Finch not as an admirer, but as a betrayer, the ultimate symbol of the order he despised. They reached the salt mine on the second day. It was a deep, dry shaft carved into the earth, a place of profound silence and geological stasis. They lowered Jonah into the mine with food and water, enough to last for months. As they prepared to seal the entrance, Jonah spoke one last time, his voice no longer a musical hum but a low, venomous hiss. "You cannot contain the universe, Doctor. You think you have won, that you have preserved your precious order, but you have only created a new pattern, a pattern of a man who hunts monsters. And every hunter, eventually, becomes the monster he pursues. I will wait for you." Decay is patient. They sealed the mine with heavy timbers and rocks, entombing the boy in the salt-filled darkness. Dr. Alistair Finch had won. He had successfully identified, analyzed, and contained a second active catalyst. He had saved a community and averted further tragedy. But as he rode away from the sealed mine, Jonah's final words echoed in his mind. He had looked into the abyss, and the abyss had looked back and spoken his name. He was no longer just a doctor or a scientist. He had become something else, something defined by the very phenomena he sought to understand. He was a collector, a hunter, a guardian of a terrible secret. And he knew with a chilling certainty that settled deep in his bones that his work was far from over. There were other catalysts out there, other strains of the phenomenon, and his journey had only just begun. The order he fought to protect felt more fragile than ever, and the line between the observer and the observed, between the doctor and the disease, was beginning to blur in the most terrifying way. The years that followed, the entombment of Jonah, twisted Dr. Alistair Finch into a new shape. The dispassionate scientist was gone, replaced by a grim, obsessive strategist. He moved through the burgeoning cities of the American East, no longer a man of medicine, but a phantom living in the margins, his life a singular, secret crusade. He had sold his family's estate in Boston, converting his inheritance into a liquid fund that allowed him to travel and live without attracting attention. He subscribed to dozens of newspapers, corresponded with engineering firms and financial institutions under a variety of assumed names, and built a vast, clandestine network of information. He was no longer waiting for disasters to be reported. He was creating predictive models, searching for the faint, statistical tremors that might signal the emergence of a new catalyst. His journals, once filled with medical observations, now contained complex charts tracking industrial output, telegraphic signal degradation, and inexplicable financial volatilities. He was using the ghost of Thaddeus Crane's logic and the specter of Jonah's methodology to hunt for their kin. He had, as the boy in the salt mine had prophesied, become a hunter of monsters, and his methods were becoming monstrously efficient. In the late autumn of 1892, his search led him to Chicago. The city was a roaring, thrumming monument to human ambition, a symphony of steel, steam, and electricity, preparing to unveil its masterpiece, the world's Columbian Exposition. The White City, rising from the swamplands along Lake Michigan, was the ultimate expression of Victorian order, a meticulously planned universe of neoclassical buildings, serene lagoons, and dazzling electrical displays. To Dr. Finch, it was the most complex system ever assembled, and therefore the most vulnerable. It was a beacon that would inevitably attract the very force of chaos he hunted. His data had pointed him there for months. There had been a series of small, baffling panics on the Chicago Board of Trade, sudden price collapses that had no basis in market fundamentals. Telegraphic messages between brokerage houses were being mysteriously corrupted, with numbers transposed and orders altered in ways that caused momentary financial havoc. Bank ledgers, kept by the most meticulous clerks, were being found with inexplicable errors, columns of figures that refused to add up, as if the very laws of arithmetic were fraying at the edges. These were not the spectacular mechanical failures of Prosperity's Reach, or the biological decay of the New Dawn. This was a new strain, a more subtle and insidious one. This catalyst did not break things. It corrupted information. It introduced noise into the signal, doubt into the data, entropy into the very systems of trust and knowledge that held the modern world together. Finch took a room in a boarding house near the financial district, a small dark space that smelled of coal smoke and fried onions. He spent his days moving through the canyons of new skyscrapers, a gray, anonymous figure in the bustling crowds. He was searching for the epicenter, the patient zero of this informational plague. He interviewed telegraph operators who spoke of ghosts in the wire, strange melodic patterns of clicks that would override their transmissions. He spoke with bank managers who described a sense of numerical vertigo that would overcome their clerks, making them doubt their own calculations. He posed as a potential investor, spending hours in the viewing galleries of the stock exchange, not watching the prices, but watching the people. He was looking for the still point in the turning world, the quiet, observant figure at the heart of the chaos. He found her in the offices of the Northern Trust Company, one of the city's largest financial institutions. Her name was Anneliese Schmidt, a 17-year-old girl who worked as a calculator, one of a small army of young women employed for their speed and accuracy in double-checking the firm's ledgers. She was an orphan, like the others, her parents lost to the Great Chicago Fire 2 decades earlier. She was exceptionally good at her job, renowned for her ability to spot errors that others missed. But in recent months, her work had become erratic. The ledgers she verified were often the ones found to contain the most baffling errors. She had been warned twice about her performance and was on the verge of being dismissed. Finch observed her for a week from a distance. He saw a young woman living in a state of quiet terror. She was thin and pale, with large, haunted blue eyes that darted nervously from side to side, as if she were constantly listening for a sound no one else could hear. She moved with a desperate, rigid control, her hands often clenched into tight fists. She was not a predator like Jonah, nor a passive void like Thaddeus. She was a victim, trapped inside a power she did not understand and could not control. This was a complication Finch had not anticipated. His work had required a degree of clinical detachment, a willingness to see the catalysts as specimens or threats. But in Anneliese, he saw not a monster, but a terrified, suffering human being. He approached her one evening as she was leaving the towering edifice of the bank, a small, frightened figure swallowed by the city's long shadows. He introduced himself as a physician studying nervous disorders, a condition he claimed her employers were concerned she might be developing due to the stress of her work. Anneliese did not seem surprised. She seemed, more than anything, relieved. "You know then," she said, her voice a fragile whisper. "You know what I do to the numbers." They talked for hours, sitting in a small, empty cafe as the city roared around them. Anneliese's story confirmed Finch's hypothesis, but with a tragic twist. She was fully aware of her effect on the world. She explained that for as long as she could remember, she had possessed a unique form of synesthesia. To her, numbers, data, and complex systems were not abstract concepts. She perceived them as a kind of music, a symphony of interconnected patterns. But her presence, her own consciousness, acted as a dissonant note in that symphony. When she focused on a system, her mind would try to harmonize with it, but the attempt would invariably corrupt the very information she was trying to process. "It's like I'm a walking mistake in the math of the world," she explained, tears streaming down her pale cheeks. "The harder I try to be accurate, the more errors I create. When I check a ledger, my focus makes the numbers change. When I listen to the telegraph, my attention creates static. I love the patterns, Doctor, I love the order, but my very nature destroys it. I am a glitch in the system." She confessed that she had been living in a state of constant, exhausting mental effort, trying to suppress her own mind, to think of nothing, to become a blank, lest her focus unravel another part of the world. But the complexity of Chicago, the sheer, overwhelming torrent of information, was making it impossible. Her effect was growing stronger, bleeding out beyond her immediate control. She was terrified of what would happen when the World's Fair opened, with its millions of visitors, its vast electrical grid, its intricate schedules and systems. She feared her influence would cascade, triggering a city-wide failure of a kind the world had never seen. She looked at Dr. Finch, her eyes pleading. "I read about you," she whispered, confirming the doctor's deepest fear that his own secretive work had created a pattern that a catalyst could detect. "I read the old stories from Colorado and Iowa. I knew you were looking. I've been praying you would find me. You have to help me. You have to stop me." Dr. Finch was faced with the ultimate test of his life's work. Here was a catalyst who was not a threat to be neutralized, but a patient begging for a cure. But how could he cure a fundamental property of existence? He thought of the solutions of the past. The cave for Thaddeus, the salt mine for Jonah. But how could he isolate someone from information itself? In a city like Chicago, information was like the air, ubiquitous and inescapable. There was no cave, no mine that could contain her effect. For the first time, Finch felt the crushing weight of his own limitations. He had spent a decade becoming the world's foremost expert on a phenomenon that had no name, but he had no remedy. He was a doctor with a terminal patient. The days leading up to the opening of the exposition were a nightmare. Annalise's condition worsened. The city's informational infrastructure began to show signs of critical strain. A brief but terrifying panic swept the stock exchange when the tickers began printing nonsensical symbols. A water-pumping station on the lakefront, controlled by a new electrical switching system, failed, causing a water shortage in several neighborhoods. Annalise, confined to her small room, was growing weaker, as if the effort of suppressing her own nature was draining her life force. Dr. Finch knew a choice had to be made. He could reveal Annalise to the authorities, but what would they do? Lock her in an asylum? Subject her to cruel and useless experiments? He knew that society, faced with a threat it could not understand, would inevitably resort to brutality. He remembered the giant cedar tree in the Washington woods and the fate of Elspeth. He would not allow that to happen again. Jonah's prophecy echoed in his mind. Every hunter eventually becomes the monster he pursues. What was the monstrous act here? Was it to allow the city to face a potential catastrophe, or was it to take matters into his own hands? He was a doctor. His oath was to preserve life, but his self-appointed mission was to preserve order. Here, in this final, terrible case, those two duties were in direct and irreconcilable conflict. He sat with Annalise on the eve of the fair's opening. The city outside was a blaze of electric light, a celebration of the very order she was doomed to unravel. She was calm now, a strange peace having settled over her. "There is no other way, is there, Doctor?" she asked softly. Finch, his face etched with a grief deeper than any he had ever known, could only shake his head. "I have studied chemistry, Annalise," he said, his voice thick with the weight of his confession. "From a previous case. There are compounds that can stop a biological system with a minimum of distress. It is quick, it is painless." He was offering her not a cure, but a release. A medical procedure that was also an execution. A final, merciful act of containment. Annalise looked at him, and for the first time, he saw not fear in her eyes, but a profound and heartbreaking gratitude. "To be a mistake is a painful thing, Doctor," she said. "Thank you for being willing to correct it." That night, in a quiet room as the city celebrated its triumph of order, Dr. Alistair Finch broke his most sacred oath to uphold his most terrible duty. He administered a lethal dose of morphine to Annalise Schmidt, holding her hand as her troubled, chaotic life ebbed away. As she took her last breath, he felt a change in the air. A subtle, indefinable quiet. The faint hum of the city's electrical grid outside the window seemed to steady, to find its proper rhythm. The glitch had been removed from the system. Order had been restored. Finch sat with the body for a long time, the full weight of his actions settling upon him. He had saved the city. He had prevented a catastrophe. He had shown a suffering soul a final mercy. And he had become a killer. He had finally and irrevocably crossed the line between the observer and the observed. He had not just contained the disease, he had become its final, terrible symptom. After arranging Annalise's death to look like a suicide, a tragic end for a troubled young woman, Dr. Finch returned to his boarding house. He took out the dozen leather-bound journals that contained his life's work, the meticulous records of Thaddeus, Elspeth, and Jonah, the complex charts, the newspaper clippings, the scientific theories, the field guide to the end of the world. He looked at them and saw not a monument to scientific inquiry, but a curse. This knowledge, this hunt, had led him here, to this moment of profound moral compromise. He now understood that the knowledge itself was the true catalyst of chaos. As long as it existed, the hunt would continue, the pattern would repeat. He built a fire in the small iron stove in his room. One by one, he fed the journals to the flames, watching as the ink curled and the pages turned to black ash. He watched as Thaddeus Crane's impossible physics, Elspeth Carter's entombment, Jonah's malevolent chemistry, and Annalise Schmidt's tragic symphony all dissolved into smoke and memory. He was erasing the signature, destroying the evidence, not to protect himself, but to protect the world from the terrible knowledge he had unearthed. When the last page was gone, Dr. Alistair Finch packed his single bag, walked out of the boarding house, and disappeared into the anonymous crowds of Chicago. He was no longer a doctor, no longer a scientist, no longer a hunter. He was simply a man, one who had looked into the deepest cracks in the foundation of the world and had done what he thought was necessary to seal them. The White City opened the next day to great fanfare, a dazzling temporary dream of order that would in time be dismantled and forgotten. No one ever knew how close it had come to a different, more chaotic fate, or the terrible price that had been paid for its brief, shining moment of perfection. And so the story of the human catalysts ends, not with an answer, but with an act of erasure, leaving only the chilling question of whether Dr. Finch truly ended the pattern, or if he simply became its final, silent victim. What choice would you have made in Dr. Finch's position? Was his final act a monstrous crime, or a necessary, merciful sacrifice? Share your thoughts on this profound moral dilemma in the comments below. We believe the deepest mysteries are the ones that force us to question ourselves. If these explorations into the shadows of history resonate with you, please subscribe and join our community. There are always more secrets waiting in the archives, and the most important stories are the ones the world has tried to forget. Thank you for joining us on this journey. Until next time, question everything, especially the nature of the order you take for granted.